The first rays of the morning sun pierced through the wooden shutters, casting long shadows across the room. Frederick de Houtman, a Dutch explorer, sat hunched over a pile of papers, his quill scratching feverishly against the parchment. The year was 1603, and de Houtman was compiling a grammar of a language he had encountered during his voyages to the East Indies. But this was no ordinary task. He was creating a tool that could bridge the gap between two worlds, and it was about to spark a revolution. As de Houtman worked, he couldn't shake off the memories of the harsh conditions he had faced. The scorching heat, the unfamiliar customs, and the constant threat of disease had nearly broken him. Yet he persevered, driven by a vision of a new world where communication could foster understanding and cooperation. His grammar was just the beginning. He also translated the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and a catechism, all of which would be used to spread Christianity among the native populations. But the real shock came when de Houtman's work reached the hands of Philips van Marnix, Saint Aldegund, a prominent Dutch theologian. Van Marnix saw the potential in de Houtman's translations and immediately began to use them to further the Dutch colonial mission. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, was expanding its reach, and these religious texts were seen as a way to civilize and convert the heathens of the East Indies. The company's leaders, including Van Boitelier, Van Asperen, and the Protestant Church, saw this as a divine mission, a way to spread the word of God and secure their dominion over new lands. The shock waves rippled through the Dutch colonies. In Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies, a new church order was implemented in 1624. This order, drafted by Antonio van Diemen, laid down strict rules for the conduct of the clergy and the faithful. It was a clear sign that the Dutch were not just traders, but also missionaries. The church became an integral part of the colonial administration, with deacons managing poorhouses and orphanages, and ministers overseeing the moral and spiritual well-being of the settlers and the native population. The religious zeal of the Dutch colonizers was not limited to the East Indies. In 1602, a Dutch fleet, led by Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Coen, arrived on the shores of Java. Coen was a man of strong convictions, and he believed that the Dutch mission in the East Indies was not just about trade, but also about spreading Christianity. He enforced a policy of religious tolerance, stating, "Each one should serve God according to the faith given to him, without hating or giving any cause for dispute, so that they will treat each other with all friendship and leave the rest to God, who is of faith and mind and will be." Despite Coen's words, the reality on the ground was often harsh. The native populations were often treated as second-class citizens, and their traditions and beliefs were suppressed. The Dutch colonizers saw themselves as bringers of civilization, and they used religion as a tool to control and subjugate the local populations. The translation of religious texts and the establishment of churches were part of a broader strategy to impose Dutch culture and values. The shock of this transformation was felt not just in the East Indies but also in other Dutch colonies. In Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, the Dutch established a mission in 1624, led by Reverend Robert Junius and Reverend Gerhard Candidius. They reported that the native population was a very poor and miserable people, deprived of all knowledge of God, living like animals. The Dutch saw it as their duty to bring them to the knowledge of the truth, but this often meant forcing them to abandon their own beliefs and customs. The Dutch also extended their reach to the Cape of Good Hope, where they established a colony in 1652. Unlike in the East Indies, the Dutch at the Cape focused on cultivating a colony of settlers to provide fresh food for the crews of ships passing by. However, the religious aspect was not forgotten. The Dutch Reformed Church played a significant role in the social and moral life of the colony. and the deacons were responsible for managing the poor and the orphans. The shock of the Dutch colonial mission continued to reverberate through the years. In 1637, the Dutch colony in Brazil faced a similar religious transformation. The Calvinist missionaries, led by figures like Telink and Oudemans, saw the conversion of the native population as the greatest fruit of their mission. They believed that the conversion of the poor heathens was essential for the success of their colonial enterprise. The Dutch East India Company's religious mission was not just about spreading Christianity. It was also a way to justify their colonial expansion and control. The company's directors, including the influential Johannes de Laet, argued that the Spanish claim to the New World was based on a false papal grant. The Dutch saw themselves as the true defenders of the Christian faith, and they used this belief to justify their own colonizing efforts. As the years passed, the religious zeal of the Dutch colonizers began to wane. The harsh realities of colonial life, the constant struggle for survival, and the increasing resistance from the native populations took their toll. By the late 17th century, the Dutch colonial mission had transformed. The focus shifted from evangelism to more practical concerns, such as trade and administration. However, the legacy of the Dutch religious mission continued to shape the colonial societies they had created. The shock of the Dutch colonial mission was not just a moment in history. It was a transformation that left an indelible mark on the lands and peoples they encountered. From the East Indies to Formosa, from the Cape of Good Hope to Brazil, the Dutch brought their faith, their culture, and their vision of a new world. The first rays of the morning sun that illuminated Frederick de Houtman's room in 1603 were just the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold for centuries to come. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was not just a trading company. It was a complex organization that had a significant impact on the regions where it operated. The VOC's presence influenced local governance, religion, and social structures, often in ways that were both intended and unintended. Adrian van Dam, a Dutch official, wrote a detailed account of the VOC's activities and governance over a period of 8 years. This work, commissioned by the Heeren XVII, the 17 directors of the VOC, was not published until 1927. It was meant to be a confidential document, providing an accurate record of the company's operations from its founding. Van Dam's account is a valuable resource for understanding how the VOC functioned internally and its impact on the regions it controlled. The VOC's approach to religion was a mix of pragmatism and piety. While the company was primarily focused on trade, it also had a duty to promote the Reformed, Calvinist faith. In some regions, like the Cape of Good Hope, the VOC faced challenges in maintaining religious discipline. For example, church leaders often complained about the influence of Buddhist, Muslim, and indigenous practices on the local population. These complaints highlight the tension between the VOC's commercial interests and its religious mission. In other areas, such as Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, the VOC took a more active role in religious and educational matters. School inspections were conducted by company officials known as scholarks, who worked alongside religious leaders. This system ensured that education aligned with the company's religious and cultural values. Similarly, in Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, the VOC's schools were under the jurisdiction of judicial officers, further integrating religious and administrative functions. The VOC's efforts to spread the Reformed faith were not always successful. Despite the company's best efforts, many local populations retained their traditional beliefs and practices. For instance, in the Banda Islands, the local church councils, kerkerads, frequently reported difficulties in converting the indigenous population. These challenges were often due to the deep-rooted nature of local customs and the limited resources available to the VOC's religious leaders. The company's religious policies also had a significant impact on social structures. In Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, the VOC implemented measures to encourage marriage and family formation among the European and Eurasian populations. The consistory, church council, provided financial incentives to orphans who chose to marry, aiming to promote stability and continuity in the community. However, these policies also reflected the racial and social hierarchies that the VOC sought to maintain. One of the most infamous episodes in the VOC's history is the shipwreck of the Batavia in 1629. After the ship ran aground off the coast of Western Australia, a group of mutineers took control and committed horrific acts of violence, including the murder of more than 100 passengers. This event raised questions about the company's responsibility and the moral compass of its employees. The incident was a stark reminder of the potential for chaos and moral decay in the company's far-flung operations. The VOC's approach to poverty and social welfare was also a reflection of its religious and social values. The company's diaconates, charitable institutions, were funded through a combination of company resources and voluntary contributions. However, the level of support varied widely across different regions. In some areas like Ceylon, the diaconates received minimal funding, leading to complaints from local church leaders about the inadequacy of support for the poor. The relationship between the VOC and the local populations was complex and often strained. While the company provided some benefits, such as education and economic opportunities, it also imposed strict controls and often failed to address the needs and desires of the local communities. The tension between the VOC's commercial goals and its religious and social responsibilities continued to be a source of conflict throughout its existence. The VOC's legacy is a mixed one. It played a crucial role in the economic and cultural development of the regions it controlled, but it also left behind a legacy of exploitation and cultural disruption. The company's efforts to promote the Reformed faith and maintain social order were often at odds with the needs and aspirations of the local populations. Despite these challenges, the VOC's impact on the regions it controlled continues to be felt to this day. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, operated a vast network of colonies and trading posts across the globe, from Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, to Cape Town. In these far-flung outposts, the company not only sought wealth but also aimed to spread their version of Christianity, which was deeply rooted in Calvinist beliefs. This chapter delves into how the Dutch managed the churches and the poor in these colonies, and the challenges they faced in converting the local populations. In Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies, the church played a crucial role in the community. The deacons or church leaders responsible for caring for the poor were given the task of overseeing the poorhouse and orphanage. This responsibility was taken very seriously, and the deacons worked hard to ensure that those in need were cared for. However, the deacons often found themselves in conflict with the consistory, the group of ministers and elders who governed the church. These conflicts arose over various issues, such as the management of the poor and the construction of buildings for the church and the poorhouse. For example, in 1656, the deacons and the consistory had a significant disagreement over the renovation of a building for the orphanage. The consistory felt that the deacons should have consulted them before making such a decision, but the deacons argued that they had the authority to act independently. This tension between the deacons and the consistory continued for many years, with each side vying for control over church affairs and the care of the poor. In addition to these internal conflicts, the Dutch faced the challenge of converting the local populations to Christianity. In places like Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, the Dutch tried to establish a presence and spread their faith. George Candidius, a Dutch missionary, wrote about his efforts to convert the native Formosans, noting that while some had learned about Christianity from the Portuguese, many had reverted to their traditional beliefs. The Dutch missionaries faced significant resistance and often struggled to make inroads. In Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, the Dutch also aimed to convert the local population. They established strict rules for receiving aid, requiring recipients to be at least nominal Christians. This policy was intended to encourage conversion, but it also created tension with the local community and raised concerns among Dutch church leaders in Amsterdam, who worried that giving too much control to civil authorities could undermine the church's role. The Dutch also had to address the issue of slavery, which was widespread in their colonies. Many slaves were brought to places like Batavia and Cape Town, and the Dutch had to decide how to integrate them into the Christian community. Some Dutch reformed leaders, like Justus Hernius, opposed slavery and advocated for the humane treatment of slaves. However, the reality on the ground was often different, and the Dutch continued to engage in the slave trade, albeit with some reluctance and debate within the church. In the Cape Colony, the deacons played a similar role in caring for the poor and managing the orphanage. The conditions in Cape Town were challenging, with many free Dutch settlers struggling to make a living due to the company's commercial monopoly and the presence of a large slave population. The deacons had to balance the needs of the poor, including both free settlers and slaves, while also adhering to the strict guidelines set by the company and the church. The Dutch also tried to convert the local Khoikhoi and other indigenous groups in the Cape. However, the process of conversion was slow and often met with resistance. The Khoikhoi and other groups had their own traditions and beliefs, and the Dutch missionaries found it difficult to persuade them to abandon their ways for Christianity. Despite these challenges, some Khoikhoi did convert and were baptized, although the numbers were relatively small. In the Moluccan Islands, the Dutch faced similar challenges. The deacons in places like Ambon and Ternate worked to provide for the poor and manage the church's affairs. They sent reports back to Batavia and Amsterdam, detailing their efforts and the challenges they faced. The church in the Moluccas struggled to maintain a strong presence, as the local populations were often resistant to conversion, and the Dutch had to contend with the presence of other European powers in the region. Throughout the Dutch colonies, the church and the deacons played a crucial role in managing the poor, caring for orphans, and attempting to convert the local populations. However, these efforts were often met with resistance and conflict, both within the church and from the local communities. The Dutch had to navigate a complex web of religious, social, and economic factors, and their efforts to spread Christianity and care for the poor were often hindered by the realities of colonial life. The Dutch also had to grapple with the ethical implications of their actions, particularly regarding slavery and the treatment of indigenous peoples. While some Dutch leaders and missionaries opposed these practices, the company's policies and the broader context of the time often made it difficult to enact meaningful change. Despite these challenges, the Dutch continued to see their mission in the colonies as a religious and moral duty, even as they struggled to balance their ideals with the harsh realities of colonial rule. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was not just a trading company. It was also a major player in spreading Christianity, especially the Protestant faith, in the regions it controlled. This involved a lot of careful planning and communication between the church councils and the religious authorities back in the Netherlands. The records from this period show how the church leaders tried to manage and shape the religious landscape in these far-flung colonies. In Batavia, the capital of the VOC's territories in the East Indies, the church council, known as the Kerkeraad, played a crucial role. They were responsible for overseeing the religious life of the community, from the conduct of church services to the education of children. The Kerkeraad in Batavia often wrote letters to the church authorities in the Netherlands, such as the Walcheren Classis and the Amsterdam Classis, to to seek guidance and report on their activities. One of the main concerns of the Kerkerad was the challenge of converting local populations to Christianity. They found it difficult to compete with the Catholic Church, which had a strong presence in many areas. Catholicism, with its elaborate ceremonies and use of religious images, was more appealing to many people. For example, in a letter from Batavia to the Walcheren classis in 1719, the Kerkerad noted that the Catholics' use of images and grand rituals made their religion more attractive to locals, who were used to similar practices in their own traditions. The Kerkerad also worried about the sincerity of new converts. They wanted to ensure that people were not just converting for material benefits or to avoid punishment. To address this, they set up consistory meetings where they would interview prospective converts to assess their understanding of Christian teachings and their commitment to the faith. This was a rigorous process, and not everyone who applied to join the church was accepted. Another significant issue was the enforcement of moral order. The Kerkerad tried to eliminate the influence of other religions and practices that they considered immoral or heretical. They would report to the Governor-General and other authorities about the need to suppress these practices and enforce stricter moral standards. For instance, in a letter from 1655, the Kerkerad in Batavia requested stronger action against the worship of local deities and the practice of ancestor veneration. Education was another key area of focus. The Kerkerad believed that teaching children the principles of Christianity was essential for the long-term survival of the faith. They set up schools where children were taught the basics of the Christian religion, along with reading, writing, and arithmetic. The curriculum also emphasized obedience to parents and authorities, and the cultivation of good manners. The Kerkerad was particularly concerned that all instruction should be in Dutch, to promote the use of the language and ensure that the teachings were not diluted by local dialects. The Kerkerad also faced challenges in maintaining the quality of religious instruction. They often had to deal with underqualified or poorly motivated schoolmasters and preachers. In some cases, they had to request that the VOC send more competent personnel from the Netherlands. For example, in a letter from 1676, the Kerkerad in Amboina expressed frustration with the lack of qualified teachers and asked for more support from the Amsterdam classis. Despite these challenges, the Kerkerad and other church councils in the VOC territories made significant efforts to spread the Protestant faith. They recognized the importance of adapting their methods to the local context while still maintaining the core principles of their religion. This involved a delicate balance between preserving the purity of their teachings and making the faith accessible to a diverse population. The letters and reports from this period provide a fascinating glimpse into the complex and often fraught process of religious conversion and education in the VOC's colonies. They show how the church leaders grappled with the challenges of cultural differences, moral enforcement, and the practicalities of running religious institutions in far-flung and diverse regions. These efforts left a lasting impact on the religious landscape of the East Indies and other parts of the world where the VOC had a presence. The Dutch East India Company, often known as the VOC, had a vast reach across the seas, from the Spice Islands to the Cape of Good Hope. One of the many tasks the VOC undertook was the establishment and maintenance of schools and churches in the regions they controlled. These institutions were crucial for spreading Christianity and educating the local populations. However, the journey of these schools and churches was not always smooth. In the early 1670s, a report from Saparua and Nuzalot described the condition of the local schools and churches. The inspector noted that while the students might not have been the best, the schoolmasters were doing a commendable job. This pattern was repeated in various other regions, such as Haruku and the southern coast of Seram. Despite the challenges, the schoolmasters often received praise for their dedication. The Ternate Church Council regularly sent reports to the Batavia Church Council, detailing the state of schools and churches. In 1683, they noted that while the quality of education was sometimes lacking, the schoolmasters were working hard to improve. Similar reports came from other regions, such as North Sulawesi and the Sangi Islands. These documents provide a glimpse into the daily struggles and successes of the educators and church leaders. However, not all was positive. In some cases, inspectors complained about the low quality of education. For example, in 1669, a report from Haruku Saparua and Nusa Laut criticized the lack of learning among the students, even though the schoolmasters were praised. This issue was not unique to one region, and was a recurring theme in many reports. The challenges were not limited to the quality of education. There were also concerns about the native teachers. In 1674, a report from Ambon, Manapa, Wano, Seram, Saparua, and Nusa Lot highlighted the lack of learning among the native teachers, which affected the overall quality of education. These issues were discussed in various councils and letters, reflecting the ongoing struggle to improve the educational system. The Dutch also faced challenges in their mission work. In Formosa, for instance, Governor Verber reported in 1654 that the local population, often referred to as blind people and idolatrous Indians, were difficult to convert. They were seen as deeply entrenched in their own beliefs and practices, making the spread of Christianity a challenging task. The Batavia Church Council communicated regularly with the Walcheren Classis, a church body in the Netherlands, to discuss these issues. In 1719, a letter from Batavia highlighted the need for better support and resources for the schools and churches. The correspondence between these bodies provides a window into the administrative and religious dynamics of the time. Despite the challenges, there were also moments of success. In 1695, a report from Haruku, Saparua, Nusa, Laut, and the southern coast of Seram noted that the schoolmasters were making significant progress, even if the students were not always up to par. This shows that while the journey was difficult, there were also signs of improvement and hope. The Dutch also grappled with the diversity of religious beliefs in the regions they controlled. In Ceylon, for example, there were significant Muslim and Buddhist populations. The Colombo Church Council, in its minutes, often discussed the challenges of converting these groups. The council noted that many of these individuals had only a vague understanding of their own religions, making it even harder to introduce them to Christianity. The Cape of Good Hope, another important Dutch colony, faced similar challenges. In 1697, the Cape Church Council reported to the Amsterdam Classis about the state of the local churches and schools. They noted that while the number of church members was growing, there were still significant challenges in terms of education and religious instruction. The Dutch also had to deal with the tenacity of local religious cultures. In the Aru Islands, for example, a report from 1704 noted that 4 Muslims had asked to be baptized. The pastor, however, determined that their interest in baptism was more social than religious, driven by their associations with Christians in their community. This highlights the complex interplay between religious conversion and social dynamics. In Ceylon, the revered Sufi Sheikh Yusuf Makassari was exiled to Colombo in 1684, and later to the Cape of Good Hope in 1694. His influence among the Muslim population in Ceylon was significant, even though the extent of his work is not well documented. This shows that the religious landscape in these regions was complex and multifaceted, with various influences and beliefs coexisting and sometimes clashing. Overall, the Dutch East India Company's efforts to establish and maintain schools and churches were marked by a mix of successes and challenges. The reports and letters from the time provide a rich tapestry of the religious and educational landscape in the Dutch colonies, reflecting the struggles and achievements of those involved. In the vast Dutch colonial empire, language played a crucial role in spreading the Christian faith. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the Reformed Church faced many challenges in converting the local populations who spoke a variety of languages. These challenges were not just about translating religious texts, but also about understanding and adapting to local cultures. In Ceylon, a place now known as Sri Lanka, the Dutch missionaries faced a significant linguistic divide. Simon Cat, a Dutch minister, pushed for the establishment of the seminary in Colombo to train native teachers in Dutch. His goal was to have these teachers educate children in their native languages, which would help them better understand the teachings of the Reformed Church. However, this idea was met with resistance from the Amsterdam classes, who were skeptical of using local languages in religious instruction. In Formosa, which is now Taiwan, the Dutch also struggled with language. The Taiwan Consistory, a group of church leaders, wrote to the Amsterdam classis about the difficulties they faced. They explained that while they tried to teach in Dutch, many of the local people did not understand the language. This led to a situation where the clergy had to use local languages, like the Formosan language, to communicate effectively. Despite this, the Dutch authorities in Batavia and Amsterdam often pushed for the use of Dutch, believing it was essential for the spread of the Reformed faith. In Brazil, the situation was even more complex. The Dutch controlled a large area in the northeast, and the local population included Portuguese, Creoles, and mestizos. The Dutch Calvinist ministers often felt alienated by the Portuguese, who viewed them as half-Jewish because of the Dutch East India Company's WIC acceptance of Jews in the colony. This created a significant cultural and religious divide. The classis in Brazil complained about the lack of support from the Dutch authorities in their efforts to convert the local population. The Dutch also faced challenges in the Moluccas, a group of islands in what is now Indonesia. In Ambon, the church leaders reported that many people converted to Christianity for practical reasons, such as gaining protection against their enemies, rather than genuine religious belief. This made it difficult to maintain the purity of the faith. The Bonde Kerkenraad, a church council, even resolved to only allow baptized members to take communion if they understood the Dutch language, ensuring they grasped the Word of God. In Ceylon, the Colombo Kerkenraad, another church council, faced similar issues. They practiced a policy of dividing the sacraments, meaning that while people could be baptized, they could not take communion unless they demonstrated a good understanding of the Reformed faith. This policy was often met with frustration from the local population, who felt it was unfair and exclusionary. The Dutch also tried to standardize religious instruction across their colonies. In 1745, Governor-General Gustav Willem, Baron von Imhoff, opened a seminary in Batavia to train ministers for Asia, but it only lasted 10 years. The VOC also sponsored the Walius Seminary at the University of Leiden in 1622, but that too closed after a decade. These efforts showed the Dutch commitment to spreading their faith, but also the challenges they faced in maintaining such institutions. One of the most significant linguistic challenges was translating religious texts into local languages. In the Moluccas, the church leaders often used Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Tupian in their sermons because many people did not understand Dutch. This created a divide between the clergy, who were mostly Dutch, and the local population who spoke a variety of languages. In Ceylon, Philip de Vries, a Dutch minister, faced a long conflict with other ministers over his translations of the Old and New Testaments into Portuguese. He requested that the Dutch authorities review and approve his translations, but this was met with resistance. De Vries' struggle highlights the tension between the desire to use local languages to spread the faith and the insistence on using Dutch to maintain control and purity. The Dutch also encountered similar issues in Formosa. Pieterszoon consistory reported that while they tried to teach in Dutch, many people could not understand the language. This led to a situation where the clergy had to use local languages, which the Dutch authorities often viewed as less pure and less effective for religious instruction. Despite these challenges, the Dutch continued to push for the use of Dutch in their colonies. They believed that mastering the Dutch language was essential for salvation. This belief was rooted in the idea that understanding the Word of God in its original form was crucial for true faith. However, this often created more barriers than it broke down, as many people in the colonies struggled to learn Dutch and felt excluded from religious life. In the end, the Dutch faced a complex and often contradictory approach to language and religion in their colonies. While they recognized the importance of using local languages to communicate with the local population, they also insisted on the use of Dutch to maintain control and ensure the purity of their faith. This tension between practicality and ideology shaped the way the Reformed Church operated in the Dutch colonial empire. In the bustling, diverse world of the Dutch East Indies during the 17th and 18th centuries, the relationship between the Dutch colonial authorities and the local populations was complex and often fraught with tension. One of the key areas of this tension was the role of the Protestant Church and its missionaries. These missionaries, often sent by the Dutch East India Company, BOC, were tasked with spreading the Christian faith among the indigenous people. However, their approach and methods often led to significant conflicts and resistance. Take, for example, the complaints of Reverend W. de Bitter, who wrote to the High Government in Batavia in September 1672. He highlighted the difficulties faced by the Dutch missionaries in their efforts to convert the local populations. The challenges were not just about language barriers, but also about cultural differences and the resistance of the local people to adopt new religious practices. De Bitter's letter echoed similar concerns raised by other missionaries in different regions, such as Bachin and Makian, where schools and churches struggled to gain a foothold. Zacharias Coen, a school teacher in the region, wrote to Governor Jacob Copps in 1670, sharing his own struggles. He described the challenges of teaching in a multilingual environment and the resistance from local parents who were skeptical of the Dutch educational system. These letters paint a picture of a colonial administration that was often out of touch with the needs and desires of the local population. Petrus van der Worm, another missionary, provided a detailed account of the state of churches and schools in Ambon in 1692. He noted the difficulties in maintaining a consistent presence and the need for more support from the colonial administration. Similar reports from other regions, such as Haruku and the south coast of Siram, echoed these concerns, highlighting the widespread nature of the issues faced by the missionaries. The Dutch language policy in the colonies was another point of contention. While the Dutch authorities often insisted on the use of Dutch, or a standardized form of Malay, local populations preferred to use their own languages. This led to significant friction, as seen in the correspondence between Simon Cat and Governor Thomas Van Ree in Ceylon in 1693. Cat noted that the Malabarese and Sinhalese languages shared many commonalities, yet the Dutch insisted on using Dutch or a standardized Malay which alienated the local population. The consistory, minutes from Colombo, Ceylon, provide further insight into these conflicts. In 1742, the consistory reported on the difficulties of translating religious texts into local languages and the resistance of the local population to these efforts. The lack of trained translators and the cultural barriers made it challenging to effectively communicate the Christian message. In Formosa, the Dutch missionaries faced similar challenges. Johannes du Preit wrote to the Batavia Church Council in 1625, detailing the difficulties in converting the local population. The Taiyuan consistory also wrote to the Amsterdam Classis in 1648, expressing their frustration with the lack of support and resources. They noted that the local population was resistant to adopting the Dutch language and religious practices, and that the missionaries were often seen as intruders rather than helpers. The Dutch language policy was not just a matter of communication, but also a tool of control. By insisting on the use of Dutch, or a standardized Malay, the Dutch authorities were attempting to impose their cultural and religious values on the local population. This often backfired, as seen in the reports from the Tehuan Council and Consistory in 1646, where they noted that the local population was increasingly resistant to the Dutch presence. The issue of language and cultural imposition was not limited to the Dutch East Indies. In Ceylon, the Colombo Consistory faced similar challenges. In 1750, they reported on the difficulties of translating religious texts into Sinhalese and Tamil. Despite the efforts of local translators like Simon Catt, the consistory found that the local population was often resistant to these translations, preferring to use their own languages and religious practices. The tensions between the Dutch missionaries and the local populations were not just about language, but also about the broader issue of identity and otherness. The Dutch missionaries often saw themselves as bringers of civilization and enlightenment, while the local populations saw them as foreign intruders. This clash of identities led to significant resistance and conflict, as seen in the reports from various regions. In 1757, the Colombo Consistory reported on the ongoing efforts to translate religious texts into local languages. Despite the challenges, they continued to push for these translations, hoping to bridge the cultural gap. However, the resistance from the local population remained strong, as seen in the consistory's reports in 1758. The story of the Dutch missionaries in the East Indies is a complex one, filled with struggles, resistance, and the ongoing tension between cultural imposition and local identity. It highlights the challenges of colonial rule and the often devastating impact of cultural and linguistic policies on local populations. Despite the efforts of the missionaries and the colonial authorities, the gap between the Dutch and the local populations remained wide, and the legacy of these conflicts continued to shape the region for generations to come. As we close this journey through the world of 17th century Dutch Calvinist thought and missionary efforts, we see a complex tapestry of ideas, writings, and actions that shaped how these early modern thinkers understood and interacted with the non-Christian world. The letters, books, and treatises we've explored reveal a deep engagement with the peoples and cultures they encountered, often through a lens colored by their religious and cultural biases. The Amsterdam Classis, a governing body of the Dutch Reformed Church, played a crucial role in guiding and supporting the missions in far-flung places like Ceylon, Batavia, and New York. They sent letters filled with advice, encouragement, and sometimes stern warnings to the ministers and church councils overseas. These communications reflect a mix of paternalism and a genuine desire to spread their religious beliefs, often in ways that were shaped by the political and economic interests of the Dutch East India Company. BOC. One of the key figures in this narrative is Hugo Grotius, whose work De Veritate Religionis Christianae, on the truth of the Christian religion, was a pivotal text in the early modern period. Grotius argued that the natural world, as created by God, provided evidence of his existence, and that the moral and ethical teachings of Christianity were superior to those of other religions. His writings influenced many others, including Gerardus Phocius, who delved into the study of pagan religions and their connections to ancient Greek and Roman traditions. The missionaries and scholars of this era, such as Justus Hernius and Johannes Udemans, wrote extensively about the peoples they encountered in the East Indies, Ceylon, and other parts of the world. Their accounts, while often colored by their own biases, provide valuable insights into the cultures and religious practices of the time. Hernius, for example, emphasized the need for plain and simple preaching, free from intellectual complexities, to reach the hearts of the people. However, the interactions were not always positive. The letters and reports from the field often reveal a sense of frustration and disappointment as the missionaries struggled to convert the local populations. Some ministers even expressed concern that some European colonists were falling into heathen practices, which they saw as a grave threat to their Christian values. The works of Johannes Hornbeck and Gisbertus Voetius, among others, provide a deeper theological context for these missionary efforts. They wrote extensively on the nature of paganism, Islam, and other religions, often viewing them through the lens of idolatry and superstition. Boetius, in particular, was a strong advocate for the conversion of non-Christians, but his vision was rooted in the idea of planting Reformed churches in the territories controlled by the Dutch, rather than the modern concept of missions, as we understand it today. The writings of these scholars and missionaries also reveal a broader intellectual landscape of the time. They were influenced by the works of antiquarians and biblical exegetes who sought to understand the connections between ancient religions and the practices of contemporary non-Christians. This comparative approach sometimes led to the identification of similarities between pagan practices and Catholic rituals, which the Calvinists saw as a form of idolatry. Despite the challenges and conflicts, the 17th century Dutch Calvinists were part of a global network of religious and cultural exchange. Their efforts, while often driven by a sense of religious superiority, also contributed to a growing awareness of the diversity of human cultures and religious beliefs. This awareness, however imperfect, laid the groundwork for the more systematic study of world religions in the centuries that followed. As we reflect on this period, it is important to recognize both the contributions and the limitations of these early modern thinkers. Their legacy is a complex one, marked by both a desire to understand and engage with the world around them, and the imposition of their own religious and cultural values on others. This legacy continues to shape our understanding of the history of religious thought and missionary activities, reminding us of the ongoing importance of cultural sensitivity and mutual respect in our global interactions today.